Welcome to the debate. Today we're delving into one of the most intellectually disruptive fields illuminated by our source material, the complex intersection of philosophy, semiotics, and pathology, a field the text boldly labels Xenopoetics. We are not simply discussing infection. We're talking about the mechanisms by which biological contamination is translated, perhaps intentionally, into symbolic language.
Indeed. And Xenopoetics really forces us to look at disease as a literary agent and the body as a kind of text. The sheer conceptual difficulty, I think, stems from the focus on arthropod vectors and this phenomenon of symbolic infection. It demands that we discard our traditional medical and linguistic boundaries, really, at the same time.
Right, which brings us to the central interpretive challenge and, well, the focus of our debate today. It all revolves around the signature mark of this process, the xenopoetic lesion or scar. We have to determine its fundamental nature. Is this lesion primarily a semiotic inscription? So, a form of writing, a literal codex that just uses biology as its medium to manifest? Or is it fundamentally a pathogenic event, a biological rupture, necrosis and collapse, whose disorganized residues are then just, well, read by observers as text after the fact?
And I'm going to argue that the core event is defined by that pathological catastrophe, by semiotic indifference. The resulting inscription is, to me, an archive of biological failure and immunological chaos. And that means the writing is, by definition, secondary. It's a symptom of the breakdown, not a primary creation.
And I'll contend that the xenopoetic lesion functions primarily as a semiotic operator, as an archive. For me, biology serves as the necessary but ultimately subservient medium for this inscription. It's realizing a kind of machinic becoming animal and generating new language structures through contagion. So the text is the primary product. My position really rests on the premise that infection is inscription, and therefore the vector is fundamentally a scribe. The lesion is a text that is actively being written, and it thus precedes the interpretation of it as mere pathology. The source material backs this up by defining arthropod vectors not zoologically, not as insects or mites, but as semiotic operators.
That framing is deeply appealing, and its elegance, I'll give you that, but it seems to leap past the immediate reality of the contamination itself. You focus on the writing potential, whereas the material defines the initial process as semiotic adhesion, a contamination of epistemology by pathogenic inscriptions. So contamination, adhesion, pathological interference, those are the initiating mechanisms, not the, intentional act of a scribe.
But let's look at the structure of the writing itself. Specifically, how the psychogametes, which is the source's term for semiotic spores, how they replicate. They replicate through adhesion, which, to me, parallels Schelling's claim that art unites knowing and doing. Just as an artist deposits symbolic residues in a work, the protozoan adhesion produces these linguistic scars. The pathological event isn't just necrosis, it's a puncture that inscribes infection as art. The scar is described as being not a wound but a codex. It's a site of recursive meaning generation.
The problem with that parallel, though, while intellectually stimulating, I agree, is that it glosses over the sheer destructive nature of the medium. I mean, how can we talk about primary creation when the process leads to the liquefaction of brain tissue and semiotic necrosis? Necrosis means the death of tissue, so semiotic necrosis has to mean the death of functional meaning. That is the failure of the symbolic structure, not its creative peak.
But the creation lies precisely in the structural organization of that failure. Consider the evidence of the scarred uterus, a highly specific manifestation detailed in the source. This structure is explicitly described as not dermal, but dendritic. And this is critical. It suggests that the infection is translated into progression. It organizes the failure into a branching narrative structure. The cyst folds become sentences. The adhesions are narrative events. This structural inscription, I think, overrides biological decay as the defining event.
That's a compelling piece of evidence for organization, I'll grant you. But I would frame that organization as the body's desperate, failed attempt to contain the threat. Look at how the source reframes pathological excess, specifically mucus. I mean, mucus is a sign of disease containment and distress, yet it's called a medium of inscription, granulomatic semiotics. The text emerges not from intentional writing, but from the body's structural misalignment and its failed immunological responses, using essentially waste product as the script. And this aligns perfectly with Schelling's concept of anarchy in the ground of nature. The Xenopoem manifests this anarchy as immunological chaos and antigenic bursts. The resulting e-syllables, they aren't complex literary forms. They're parasitic condensations, lesions of speech itself. They are marks of biological crisis and structural failure.
The distinction you're drawing between structure and failure, I think that's exactly where our interpretations diverge. I argue the resulting structure, even if it's born of an immunological crisis, serves a greater semiotic function. And that function brings us directly to the concept of Deleuze and Guattari's becoming animal. I contend that the fusion between the host and the vector is intentional, it's machinic, and it fulfills the theory by establishing a zone of proximity where that biological distinction collapses. The source material positions the parasite and host as assemblages of absorption and secretion. The vector is defined as a carrier of becoming, not merely a carrier of disease. The organism, in a sense, dissolves itself into the act of writing the new text. This positive generative aspect is absolutely central to understanding the Xenopoem as an articulation of new political and molecular architectures.
Okay, I understand your reading of that synthesis, but we have to look closer at how this identity dissolution happens. I see this process aligning less with the creative becoming animal and much more closely with the becoming imperceptible. The process is one of molecular dissolution. It's the physical erasure of identity into a zone of indiscernibility, revealing a base zone of common flesh between human and arthropod, but only through decay. The material describes the parasite bursting liquefied cavities and exhaling cerebrospinal palimpsests across the body's epistemology. A palimpsest suggests erasure. It suggests overwriting, not primary creation. This is decomposition, liquefaction, and necrosis. It's the end result of overwhelming pathology. The writing is just the archive of this biological disappearance, a record stamped onto the remains.
And yet, the source insists on defining the adhesion factors and the trophozoic codices as writing instruments. The host body's subsequent hallucinations, epileptic, parakeratotic, they're categorized not as mere pathology but as a xenopoetic codex of becoming animal. The syntax of this codex is the failure itself. So it's not just memory or pathology, it's an inscriptional surface where ontological failures accumulate, making the writing the primary event that subsumes the failure into its own grammar.
But to claim that the failure is the syntax implies that the chaos is being directed toward meaning. The evidence of misrecognition, though, I think it contradicts that directionality. Let's turn to the highly specific example of fumaric acid, which the text uses precisely to clarify this line between biological reality and semiotic reading. While it functions in the Xenopoetic register, it is explicitly called a parasitological misrecognition.
Yes, and I seize upon that misrecognition as the engine of narrative. It demonstrates that the system prioritizes the semiotic reading over metabolic accuracy. Fumaric acid, a simple metabolic chain, is recoded in the insect body. It produces a literature of biochemical delirium, the conversion of simple biological processes, like IO markers to ELISA readings and metabolic precision to narrative myth. It shows that the artistic, interpretive act of recoding precedes and frames the biological observation.
But the text is clear. The acid is a metabolic chain, mistaken for host vector transmission. It is a crystallization of mistakes. The writing only emerges because the biological system failed to recognize the chain correctly. The text describes this as giving rise to the freedom of parasites, the liberation of misfolded texts from diagnostic captivity. So disorder and systemic error are the true generative forces here, not some deliberate literary translation. The parasite's nucleus captures the whole through diagnostic hydrolysis, infecting carbohydrate CO2 as narrative punctuation. The punctuation marks, the structural anchors of the narrative, are in fact biological infections being used to structure an incoherent, mistaken narrative. This suggests the biological mistake generates the structure, which is then later read as language. The collapse has to precede the transcription.
That recursive mistake, however, is precisely the mechanism of infinite inscription. The finite material of the host body is made to bear a proliferation of texts. It's the dynamic engine of textual excess, which echoes Schelling's idea of a symbolic language that is inexhaustible. And this brings us to the linguistic manifestation of the Xenopoem, glossolalia. I see the Xenopoetic glossolalia as the analog of Greek myth in Schellingian terms, a proliferation of symbolic fragments that exceed rational human mastery. The parasites become glossolalic deities, whose lesions inscribe the sacred in pathogenic form. The sheer density and infinite recursion of this inscription, well, it demonstrates that the core event is a literary creation that is achieved through contagion. It is a language whose structure is hyperdense.
I have to challenge your framing of glossolalia as a sacred text, though. The material reframes it, and very pointedly, as the eruption of speech as protozoan stutter, and crucially, a residual grammar of madness. I mean, if this is language, it's broken language. The terror of the Xenopoem, as the source states, is not mere mortality. It's the fact that grammar collapses when appendages duplicate without narrative anchor. When we analyze the physical manifestations, the lesions, the tissue duplication, they lack the smooth, linear coherence that you need for traditional symbolic meaning. The host body is attempting to communicate, but the message is being fragmented by pathogenic intrusion. The complexity here isn't depth, it's the chaotic residual condensation of semiotic material under extreme stress. The language stutters because the host's linguistic and immunological structures are completely overwhelmed.
But even the stutter is a form of coded transmission. The vector is defined repeatedly as a scribe of alien texts, a machinic gardener of chimeric blossoms, and a translator of microbial voices into human fevers. The inscription occurs regardless of the host's rational ability to process it. It's the molecular politics of becoming animal, inscribed through what the text calls an adhesion grammar. The vector utilizes the biological breakdown as the tool for its expressive purpose.
And I insist that that purpose is secondary to the pathological force. The necrotic, semiology, the granulomatous fibronectin, these are not positive creations. They're cataloged as failures of poetry. The inscription exists only because the biological structure governing linguistic organization has collapsed due to pathological overload. The body is forced to become a script in its own undoing.
So, to summarize my position, the study of xenopoetic pathology reveals that romantic aesthetics, particularly Schelling's focus on the synthesis of subject and object, really serves as an early diagnosis of semiotic pathology. The scar is primarily a recursive operator and a political molecular archive. It's an articulation of becoming that uses infection as its writing machine. The lesion itself actively generates the syntax of this new biological language.
And I would conclude by reiterating that the observed phenomena, necrotic annotations, mucosal misalignment, these ghost-written narratives, they all point to the primacy of biological breakdown and pathological collapse. The vector is not a writer creating order. It is a carrier of chaos that dissolves the host's meaning. The body becomes a codex only through a violent inscription, one born of fundamental immunological failure and molecular dissolution. It's just recording the catastrophe.
The profound value of the source material, I think, is its demonstration that the boundary between medicine and literature, between molecular breakdown and narrative function, has collapsed entirely.
Which forces every reader to assess whether the resulting Xenopoem is, fundamentally, a story of literary invention achieved through contagion, or an archive meticulously documenting a catastrophic biological and symbolic failure.